Welcome to the Classroom Podcast, the book club discussion on the classic political philosophy. My name is Eric Nganyange. I'm your host and the student in this class, sitting here with the one and only Professor Ron Klein. Professor?
How are you?
I'm blessed and highly favored. How you feeling?
I'm delighted to be here, as I always am.
Hey. John Stuart Mill on liberty.
Yep.
Who was John Stuart Mill? Why should we care about what is relevance today?
First, who's John Stuart Mill? He's the son of, I think his father's name was James,
Yes.
if I'm correct. John Stuart's father cared a lot about the education of his son. So James Mill set out a rigorous education, homeschooling, for his son John Stuart. And as was typical in the 19th century, you had to be proficient at Latin and Greek and preferably a couple other languages, typically French and German. But he covered the waterfront. I mean, science, any other discipline that was common in the 19th century. John Stuart was a great student, so it was an interesting combination. His father pushed him rather hard. And ultimately, I'm not sure what age it was, but was around the age of 20, John Stuart Mill just kind of broke down. And we can understand that. You can only tolerate so much pressure.
Oh, yeah.
Despite the fact he was really interested in the topic that he studied and was very proficient.
He was 7 when he was reading Plato's dialogue in Greek.
Yes, just like you and I have. Well, that's an amazing accomplishment.
That's insane.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Wow.
So, and he was equally proficient in Latin.
That's crazy. What do you think is relevance today? Do you think it's still relevance today with everything he wrote?
Yes, definitely. And particularly 2 works, the one we're going to talk about. But he wrote a maybe even more famous book called Utilitarianism. It's a moral theory based on the idea of, to oversimplify, the idea of you should act or have rules that would cause you to act for the greatest good of the greatest number. And so it actually is widely used in political decision-making even today. It's a flawed theory, and the flaw is serious, but it gets you started in thinking about the morality of your policies in a good way.
Yeah. What was going on in England when Mill published this book?
Charles Darwin just published his book on Origin of the Species, which kind of dominated discussion for a while. You know, Parliament had been firmly in control of the government since 1714.
Okay. Was there a lot of violation of individual liberty?
That's an interesting question. Maybe the big issue that refers to that is the trade union issue. What right do employees have to organize and make their case against the capitalist owners of the factories? And do we allow that? So it was trade unionism. And if you read Charles Dickens' book, Hard Times, you get a good picture of that. So I'd say that may be a social issue that was one of the most important.
On liberty, let's get to the book. Book has 5 chapters. It's not too long of a book. The whole notion of the book is this constant struggle between individual freedom and authority. Where to place the limit.
Yeah, and he more precisely characterizes it as the ability and wisdom of society or its government to constrain the individual. So it's kind of individual against society in that sense. So he characterizes it as how much authority should society, and maybe through its government, but even if the government's not involved, they can control the individual. So the question becomes, how much liberty should the individual have with respect to the society that the individual lives in?
On chapter 1, Mill say The struggle between liberty and authority is the most conspicuous feature in the portion of history with which we are earliest familiar, particularly in that of Greece, Rome, and England. But in old times, this contest was between subjects or classes of subjects and the government. By liberty was meant protection against the tyranny of the political rulers. So he's talking about back in Greece. They had this issue.
Well, sure. But so you can imagine that even then, a group like that would control somewhat or communication of its members. Mm-hmm. That's a family group. We grew up in families, right?
Yep.
Did your dad and mom ever control your speech?
All the time.
All the time,
yeah.
Right? You can't say that, Johnny. You should be ashamed of yourself. So it starts out being parental tyranny in a way. And still, generally speaking, the whole society existing as a family then probably supported that, at least the adults against the kids, because that's enculturation. Got to teach you what's proper. And then when we start moving into more organized societies, say in the Middle East, and there were a number of kingdoms that formed there, like Sumer and Akkad and Babylon, they don't seem to control speech too much. But when you get to Greece and Rome, it's very clear. Socrates, we remember from Greece, but they were always concerned about speech.
The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not sufficient warrant. Let's discuss about what did Mill mean about harm in 19th century.
That's the central question, my friend.
And did that definition evolved?
He gives some examples of what he thinks harm is throughout the whole book. As we're learning from Socrates, examples aren't definitions. And this is the frustrating part of the book, is he doesn't really articulate very clearly what he means by harm.
Mm-hmm. Was he talking about physical? Oh, was he talking about physical, emotional? And because I feel like the definition of what is harmful, what is not, has evolved a lot.
A lot.
I want to make sure we distinguish, because what Mill was talking about here in 19th century and what we are thinking about harmful today. So what is the definition of harmful here?
Looking through his example, it seems to be primarily physical. You know, in the last 20 years, our society has changed the way they view the word harm and what its contents are.
Yeah.
So we probably have an unlimited number of examples to choose from. But I'll start back when I was a young person, back just before the Civil War. And it's beginning to feel that way, my friend. So, well, you know, kids.
Yeah.
And I played in a Little League Baseball for a couple of years, poorly. Kids would have nicknames like Peanuts because he was little, or Slim, or Fatty. And that was not uncommon. And there were worse ones than that. But people, yeah, fine. That's a nickname. Mm-hmm. And our parents always taught us, I think this was universal, sticks and stones will hurt my bones, but words will never hurt me.
Is that true?
Yes and no.
Okay,
the sticks and stones part.
That's true.
That's true.
Yeah.
But will words never hurt me? Well, there's an ambiguity in hurt in that, because will words hurt you physically? Not directly.
Yeah.
But especially these days, we've defined words as an instrument of harm. Mm-hmm. Okay? So...
But we also know that words can really do hurt you. For instance, as a father, I need to be very careful with the words I tell my daughter.
Yes.
Because it can destroy her. Right? And I know Mill probably did not want to go that far. Once you start saying everything is harmful, it's a non-stop issue.
Exactly.
If we say any interference with the government or the society stops if my freedom harm you.
Exactly. And that sounds like a good principle, but as you've already discovered and pointed out right away, what you mean by harm is everything.
Mm-hmm. My struggle is how to clearly define harmful. And I'll take this a little bit top notch for parents who are verbally abusing their children. We can look in our society as pure harmful.
And we're all aware of that.
We
usually have seen it even in public.
But with Mill's argument, that is not a place the government need to interfere.
That's the way I understood it.
As long the parents is not put their hands on them, we need to stand back.
Yeah, and that's more complex issue. On the one hand, we say it's a parent's responsibility to. We use the word educate, but really we mean something like enculturate, right? Because we don't usually, except if we're homeschooling, you don't sit down with Jada when she's 5 years old and start her on arithmetic. Mm-hmm. But you did start her on, no, Jada, you can't do that, often for her own protection.
Yeah.
Don't put your finger in the outlets, okay? So what goes with that responsibility? And then the argument is, well, who knows the child better than their parents? And we like to say, if it's your responsibility, you get to judge how you do it. Now, we also know, in addition to verbal abuse, there's physical abuse of children, so just horrifying stories. And we certainly draw the line there. I mean, you're right. You can damage a child verbally.
The tyranny of the majorities is now generally included among the evils against which society requires to be on its guards.
Fortunately, in our country, we have a First Amendment that protects our use of words. But in our society, it's not the government stopping our speech so much. It's the rest of society. There's a great modern book called The Tyranny of Opinion. So we have now what Mill couldn't have thought of is social media. Going on now are great conflicts about the idea that a social media company can censor your speech.
Which legally they can.
Well, that's not clear. It's very interesting. They operate under certain guidelines by regulatory agencies. And part of the argument is, well, do they have a right to do that? And some people argue, well, it's their company and they publish the rules and they get to do that. As other people argue, how are they any different than radio and television that we can say, you can't say this on TV? Or you can't say it on radio. There's all the talk radio shows going on now. So if they're no different, why are there two different sets of rules? Now, people argue about, are they different or not? But the one argument is, well, they should all be regulated in the same way. Or should they not be regulated at all?
Yeah. Wow.
So, see what you're getting us into?
I know, but I think this conversation is worth having it.
Yes.
And I think it's worth kind of picking them apart, pieces by pieces, and see how we can sew them back together eventually.
Hopefully.
In your opinion, where do we place the limit between individual freedom and the social control?
One of the hardest possible questions. In our kind of society that hinges upon people choosing their government at all levels, I would think you would want to lean towards allowing greater freedom of expression. And I should say speech. They've muddied the water some by saying expression is speech, but it's not true, right? Since theoretically, the way our system's supposed to work is issues will come up. We as individual citizens in our society will talk among ourselves about what we think about that. Let's just take our city, because that's a unit we can deal with. We'll talk among ourselves. We'll talk to our representatives, like our city council or mayor. Representing us, they may vote on the issue, or they may say, well, this is an important issue. We should actually ask the citizens in a referendum to choose, right?
Chapter 2, the freedom of thought and discussion, is so relevant today. I don't know, maybe than any other time before. what Mill proposed in this chapter, I'm trying to live by that. One of the pieces that I've been working hard is not to insert my opinion in something I did not study, either if I agree or disagree.
And I totally agree with that. There's a couple aspects to that. First, you need to have freedom of conscience. That means you need to be free to study issues.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
That's very true. I didn't think about that.
Yeah, so now comes the interesting question, what am I going to study? If there's constraint in speech, and we include writing in that, what if they've cut off one half of the discussion of any issue and they only present you with things to study that are of one view?
Yeah.
Right? Same thing for the government. Some people actually think the government sometimes don't tell the truth. Imagine.
Mm-hmm. If all mankind minus one were of one opinion and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silence mankind. We're talking about minority.
Yeah. Singular minority. So if you hold an opinion and all the rest of the people in town hold a different opinion, we're not justified just because there's a huge number of us to decide that you're wrong and shut you up.
We all hold our own opinion on the things we believe in. How do you listen different argument for the purpose of understanding instead of listening for the purpose of criticizing that argument?
Well, criticism and understanding are joined. So what I really want to know is that opinion that I've heard or seen written, in fact, of my own opinions, if I'm really being good about this, I want to know if that opinion is true. That's what matters, right? Use the biblical injunction. It's the truth that makes you free.
Yes.
Right? It's the truth that leads you to doing right things. So the default position is any opinion given to you should be criticized first. Find out if the argument is any good, if they even give an argument. There are tons of logical fallacies that people commit all the time, all of us, that we've known about for 2,500 years, and we still commit them regularly.
Yeah.
Okay? So there's a lot of ways an argument can be wrong. And we've used the term logos for argument. So what does logos mean? It's a Greek word. It means a reasoned account. That means it's based on true information in a logically correct form. So the first criticism you make is, are any or all of the facts presented true? Because if they're not, you're not going to find a valid conclusion from it, depending on how many steps you have in your logos. And secondly, you should figure out if the reasoning itself is correct. That does it follow a valid logical form. So that's the way you both understand and the reason you criticize opinions that you hear. Hopefully our own as well. Now, we're pretty casual about criticizing our own opinions because we have them, so they're more likely to be true. And Socrates will argue this constantly, that to be a good person requires you to understand yourself. No small task. One of the things that's part of that is that you continually examine your opinions and beliefs to see if they're true or not, and to give them a fair hearing. That is, don't be kind to yourself in evaluating them. Be just as serious as if somebody else had that opinion.
I want to talk to you about stillman and strawman argument. So he say, he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reason may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reason on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion. Mills is pushing us, go study. Do your own homework and come back. How do we do that?
Very easy in principle, hard in practice. Why are we reading all the books we're reading together and individually? We're studying things. Now, can one human being comprehend all the things we probably ought to be studying? Let's say tomorrow in Congress somebody introduces a bill to adjust the business tax. How do we make a judgment about what kind of business tax we should?
Or how do we even criticize or say I'm against or I'm for it?
Exactly. I'll give you a case. In 2008, when we had the great financial crisis, I was just totally unable to grasp what was going on. So I spent 3 years studying economics to try to figure out, what would have been the right thing, because it's past by the time I finish. I found out economics is massively complex. There are at least 4 major schools. You've got to try to sort out which one is more right than the other for you to make an opinion.
Then you got to go back in history, figure out which one of those worked in the past.
Yeah. And do I think because it worked in the past, it might work in the future? No guarantees, right? Things change. So that's a problem we as human beings are stuck with. Too many, too complex problems to study all of them all the time. So we give ourselves shortcuts. So what do we say? Well, the way I can decide this is I'll look at which party's on which side, and the party that I sort of favor, I'll just choose their side. Because that's a shortcut.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Just think of all the thinking you saved and all the reading and all the work. I said, this is my party.
Yeah.
So I'll choose that one. The other thing we tend to do as a shortcut, some authority figure told us that this was true. Right? Let's take a simple example. Early in grade school, you learn what? 1 + 1 = what?
2.
Right. So is that true?
Based on what I was told.
And the basis of that is, well, it's the teacher, and if I don't put 2 down, she's going to mark it wrong. It turns out it is true, but they couldn't prove it was true until the late 19th century. Listen to the authority.
Christian morality, so-called, he put that in parentheses, has all the characters of a reaction. It is in great part a protest against paganism. Its ideal is negative rather than positive, passive rather than active. It holds out the hope of heaven and the threats of hell as the appointed and appropriate motives to a virtuous life. And then he finished up, it is essentially a doctrine of passive obedience. What was his thought about?
Oh, that's a complex.
God. There's a truth to that.
And Christian morality as well. There was a contemporary of his, Friedrich Nietzsche. I don't know if he'd read Nietzsche, okay?
Yeah.
But Nietzsche's argument was Christian morality is slave morality.
Oh, boy.
What you're trying to do with Christian morality, which most of us, I think, agree with, actually, is constrain the powerful people who can be evil. It's not that we are arguing as Christians that here are the positive things we should do.
Yeah.
We get a list of don't, and we have an authority figure. I don't know for sure because I haven't read everything he's read, but I have a feeling that he's absorbed some of Nietzsche's ideas, either by reading him or coming to the same conclusion.
I say there's a truth to what he said, but I usually don't want to.
Pretty harsh.
That's what I say. I usually don't want to touch in religion that much. He's your favorite thing about customs and habits. I want to get your take on chapter 3 when he's talking about the individuality, the importance of that. He said, "He who does anything because it is custom makes no choice. He gains no practice either in discerning or in desiring what is best. The mental or moral, like the muscular powers, are improved only by being used."
He's trying to pull a fast one on us, intentionally or unintentionally. He says the person who does something because it's the custom is making a mistake because he's not being critical.
Mm-hmm.
To make that more meaningful, to make a steel argument for him, he'd have to say the person who obeys all customs is not making a choice, because you can obey lots of customs and still be critical of others. Yeah. In fact, we hope that happens.
Yeah, because customs change.
And they should, because the world changed. So, we got to watch even Mill.
Oh, absolutely.
And he's a great thinker and a great writer, and you tend to sort of bow down to, well, geez, a lot smarter than I am.
Yeah, you're the only guy I know who can criticize Mill. I'm staying out of that. The spirit of improvement is not always a spirit of liberty, for it may aim at forcing improvements on unwilling people.
Sure.
Tell me, what give me an example of that.
Well, let's look at the onset of the Soviet Union. Lenin and some colleagues enter Russia. Lenin was shipped to Russia by the Germans in a closed boxcar because they wanted to get rid of him. So he shows up in Moscow, and he has some colleagues, sort of reprehensible characters. With that small group, they managed to destroy what was briefly democratic government, which had already essentially overthrown the Tsar, and imposes the tyranny of communism on them. And did they know it was coming? No, because what does he say? I'm going to make you free. This will be great. You'll love it. Don't worry. I'll take care of you. Yeah, right.
And here comes Uncle Joe Stalin.
And here comes Uncle Joe.
Chapter 4, he's talking about the society and the individual. And I think I pointed out this question earlier. Where does the authority of society begins? He said, everyone who received the protection of society owes a return for the benefit. And the fact of living in a society renders indispensable that each should be bound to observe a certain line of conduct towards the rest. Is he going back here to the harmful to others?
Yeah, and tying it to civic responsibility. There's no question that we get benefits from being in our society. And therefore we, he says, have obligations.
Yeah.
And I don't disagree with that. The question is, what are the benefits versus what are the obligations?
I'm trying to think, how do the society figure out what's the benefit they want and what they don't want?
Well, I think if I was John Stuart Mill, and I think he might argue this way too, is let people talk about it. Yeah. Let everybody make their strongest case. Let everybody else evaluate those cases. And then we have a mechanism that allows us to choose people who will do the things that collectively we decided we wanted.
Yeah.
And what our obligations would be.
And I think Bill also struggling here with the idea of individuality in a society.
That's his main point. Yeah. This is a hard problem to work out because society has legitimate claims. Mm-hmm. Individuals have legitimate claims, and somehow you have to harmonize those. He has an understandable view of that living in England, which is basically democratic in the sense that they elect members of parliament, not the monarch. People in countries like ours, we have a bias towards let's vote, and we'll decide questions that way, and let's have the maximum of free speech.
Another thing here, Mill say, no person is an entirely isolated being. It is impossible for a person to do anything seriously or permanently hurtful to himself without mischief reaching at least to his near connections, and often far beyond them. Now he say, you can never just hurt yourself.
Well, do you agree with that?
It's always other people involved.
Well, not always. You certainly can come up with cases where there are no other people involved.
Absolutely.
So why do we believe what he said? We're supposed to be critical. If Robinson Crusoe killed himself, committed suicide on his island, would that harm anybody else in the world?
Could it be the children, wife, brothers?
Yeah, ever heard of orphans? I mean, we can construct cases that would belie that assertion, I think.
Yeah.
He has a much stronger argument if he says, most of the time, if you seriously harm yourself, you're harming other people in society. Don't say always.
Yeah.
That's much stronger because now our little cases that we think up don't apply because he said most.
The notion that it is one man's duty that another should be religious was the foundation of all religious persecutions ever perpetrated, and if admitted, would fully justify them.
That's a straw man argument because he just ignores all of the benefits of religion and treating people that way. It's like some people I've heard claim that, well, look at all the wars and subsequent deaths that happened because of religion.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's two parts to that. Yes, there have been lots of wars and innumerable people killed on wars that claim to be about religion. A lot of those wars were not religious, but religion was offered up as the excuse. Yeah. Those people aren't of the same religion we are. We got to go kill them. But really, it's because whoever the ruler is thinks he'd like to take over the territory and all the glory. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, let's talk about the deaths of known atheist rulers. Okay? 150 million people just in the 20th century.
Yeah. I did not see he had positive views on religion.
Yeah, that's because he probably didn't have any.
Oh, man. Well, what do you think, Professor?
Fun discussion.
Anything else you want to add on the mail? Because, the discussion of individual freedom will always come up.
I think it's fair to say more and more speech is being constrained, both by society and
by government.
Government in the sense of the way courts rule, at least.
Yeah. So
we got to ask ourselves, as citizens of this society, have we gone too far? And if so, what do we do about it? Yeah. And if there's punishment due to people who are constraining free speech, let's say you don't like Twitter because they kicked you off for supporting some view that they don't like, what do you do about that?
Yeah. Let's say here is the apartment building we're living in. And I'm over here and I have my neighbor upstairs. I love to listen to music loud and my neighbor upstairs like to be quiet. How do we find the middle ground there? How do I exercise my freedom to listen to music loud and not violating the freedom of my neighbor being quiet?
Very good question. It's a hard issue. I will say our society's probably struggled with that pretty well because there's not a clear-cut decision either way that probably will be satisfactory.
Yeah.
So, it's almost an impossible situation to decide.
Like we say, these issues, man, in theory, they sound real good until you try to apply them to the real life.
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's really, really hard.
It becomes very, very complicated.
Yeah. That's why we study.
Yeah. Professor Ron?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your time, man.
Thank you, Eric. Wonderful discussion, as we always have.
Yes, sir.
All
yes,
right.
sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.